Hello, and welcome back to Vox Podcast, the weekly pseudo-academic pop culture analysis roundtable with drinking and swearing. My name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I'm once again here with the full crew, Katya and Wayne and Hannah. How's it going, guys?
Hey.
You know what?
What?
It's fantastic because you know who finally won some medals in the Marble League?
Ooh. I did see that. I was like, I watched it, I think the day we talked about it, you're like, oh, I'm waiting for Josh to watch Marvel. I'm like, okay, I can't say anything. But yes, I did see that you had a good day.
Not just one good day. There have been just one gold, but there have been multiple medals. The Oceanics finally came through. It's like Mississippi State. You wait and you wait and you wait all season. And it's disappointment, disappointment, disappointment. And then you all of a sudden beat LSU.
I love that Wade and Katya are like, I think those are about sports.
I only vaguely know.
Anyway, that's another episode.
Marble League episode coming up, but not today. But it has been exciting. I'm very much looking forward to Marble League. You guys are, but I'm happy that both of you are back because Wayne and I did a hurricane show without you guys last week. It wasn't really a hurricane show. We had a good show last week. It was very good, and it was silly, and it was about sex on teenage 14-year-old girl shows. By
the two middle-aged men.
That's right. Yes. We had guests.
Sure.
And since recording last week,
questions about your ex. I have questions. I have questions.
No, since we recorded that, I did go back, and this is a footnote to last week's episode for anyone listening. I went back and watched the pilot episode of That 70s Show, and oh my God, Mila Kunis is 14 years old.
Yeah.
I don't know how much I processed that at the time, that she was genuinely that much younger than everybody else.
But she's tiny. Yeah.
But watching it now,
she also is that one of the shows where she lied about how old she was to get on it?
She lied and said she was 8. She's playing a 14-year-old, and they're all playing 14 and 15-year-olds. She's supposed to be 14. They said we want actors who are going to be 18. She said, I'm going to be 18 on my birthday, and they hired her.
Right.
And she was going to be 18 on her birthday 4 seasons later.
Yeah. and the first episode, she and Kelso are having sex in the back of a car. Yeah. And he's
awkward.
He's 2.5 feet taller than she is.
Yes. Easily.
It is freakishly creepy to watch when you now again in real life, those actors grew up and got married eventually, so wonderful for them. But once you go back and watch, when
you look back on it and realize what was happening, you're like, oh no.
Yeah. So everyone, but we talk about that a lot last week, so everybody should go back and listen to last week's episode and subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify and Apple and all those other places. But we definitely need YouTube subscribers. I went and I put the video clips so you can see in last week's episode. You can see the bit on the video clip if you don't want to watch the entire pilot. But it is freakish to watch once you're aware of it. And she's like this. You feel bad about yourself. You're like, I should call someone. It's how it comes across. So
I need to call CYS on myself.
Yes.
I guess there's a reason my mother didn't let me watch that stuff.
But
I don't know how many people knew that at the time, though, because the whole point was she was lying because it would have she wouldn't have been able to.
Oh, no, I was just joking. I think my mother wouldn't let me watch it because it annoyed her. That's why she banned most things in the house.
Anyway, this is not a silly show about teen sex shows. This is about a serious topic, serious-ish, something that bugged me. So I just got grumpy one day. And
you grumpy? Never.
Well, okay, I'm frequently grumpy, but the great thing about being grumpy today, as opposed to like when I was born grumpy. I was, you should have seen the 2,000 word rant I went on, the day I was born about the Nixon administration. But
checks out.
But no, but see, now it's like, I get grumpy, I get mad at something, and we have a show, and I could just be like, I'm gonna do a show where I'm just gonna rant about this for a little bit. So
also in 2020, all rants are justified in some way.
This was a little weird. I follow mostly for work reasons, because it's my job to be culturally aware of stuff. So everybody else who blocks things like, this person's stupid, or I hate this person. And so people will block them on social media. I don't. I follow a lot of people on social media just because I think they're politically stupid and I need to know what's going on there. But I saw one that was particularly dumb. It was a meme, and the person that I was following didn't make the meme. They just reposted it. But they posted a meme that was Jimi Hendrix playing guitar at Woodstock, and it says, in 1969, when the civil rights movement and a racist cop problem actually existed, thus implying that there's no civil rights movement or racism problem today. But okay. Jimi Hendrix
seems suspect.
Yes. Jimi Hendrix played the national anthem in front of more than 500,000 anti-establishment, quote, progressive, unquote, liberal hippies. Not a single one of them protested or took a knee. And I saw that and I was just like, how fucking stupid are you? Like that was my initial thing. It's like, first off, conservatives at that point hated Jimi Hendrix's rendition of the national anthem. They thought he was making a mockery of the song. So I went and looked at the comments, not just the person who posted it, because he didn't get that. It's like 2 likes, but I clicked through the meme to see the original comments, and there were like 12,000 likes and reshares and just like 1,000 comments. So I sat there and I just read through all of them, and it was insane.
Mav, do you hate yourself?
Yes.
Is this?
Yes.
Do we need to like?
This is why we're having this show. This is a therapeutic day for me. I'm getting
All right.
Are you dwelling?
Well,
no, I just this is like I don't need to get Xanax. I have this show. It's great. So
I'm concerned for you, man. If you're punishing yourself by reading Twitter.
No, Facebook in this case. But I was reading a Facebook group, a conservative Facebook group. Yeah, in a lot of ways, and most of the people were like, yeah, Hendrix was a real patriot. I loved his version of the national anthem. He, the libs don't know what they're talking about, blah, blah, blah. And then there were a few people who were like, he was protesting. It was at Woodstock, man. What are you talking about?
And the 500,000 people who were there, or however many, 1 million people, whatever the estimates are, they weren't standing with their hands over their hearts. They were literally fucking in the mud.
Yes. Yep. And by the way, you can watch Woodstock on YouTube. You can watch it on YouTube. There's people some people were like, oh, dude, he is rocking the national anthem. There were some people doing that, and other people were just like barely acknowledging him, passing a joint back and forth. Mm-hmm. There are people rolling around in the mud having sex. That's not a joke. That's literally what Woodstock was about. And then there are people lots
of people tripping.
Yeah, and then he's
tripping balls.
Playing this guitar solo in the middle of Star Spangled Banner, and people are like, yeah, fuck the man. That's what that was about. And I was like, how does somebody misunderstand that moment to that extent and then get 15,000 people to agree with them that, yeah, that's what this was about? And I was just like, it was just insane to me. So then I started thinking about, it's not just Hendrix. There are a lot of one thing that I think happens is protests have a purpose in their time and place. But as the world, for really complicated reasons that are sort of beside the point of this episode, but just trust us on this, the world over time tends to get more, and I'm using this term with air quotes, but more what we would call liberal. It becomes more progressive. At one point you sold black people as property, and then eventually they got to vote. At one point you essentially sold women as property, and now they got to vote, and you move on. And, certainly we don't have equality today, but the world sort of gets more and more fair. It doesn't feel like it, but it does.
Well, the march of history tends to
barring certain political movements in other places, there's parts of the Middle East that have, by that metric, have regressed because of a variety of reasons.
I'm saying the world as a whole, literally the entire planet, on average, has become more fair over time. Long way to go.
In broad general terms, yes.
Long way to go. Yeah.
Other than distribution of wealth.
Yes.
And then new inequalities are made in different ways.
Pop up all the time.
But nevertheless.
Yes.
Sure, but I take your point.
Yes.
And I think it's also just aside from the realities of policy, it's the average person is arguably more liberal.
Sure. Yes. Even the average
which is a low bar.
Even the average person who considers themselves politically conservative is probably more liberal than the political conservative of Woodstock 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Is what
by certain metrics. Sure.
Is what I'm getting at.
I'll accept that with a heavy asterisk.
Yes. And that's why, I mean, this is probably a whole nother show, but I'm just saying, because I want to move on to the other topic. But I think what happens is as the baseline sort of moves, and I hate the entire, because in reality, it's a lot more complicated than left versus right. It's a whole spectrum that goes in like 8 different dimensions. But as the baseline moves from to the left in the simplistic case, the things that were being protested for, the memes attached to it, and I explained what memes means in the blog, but the ideas, but also the media, the artwork, the music that gets attached to a certain movement becomes culturally sort of disseminated throughout everything, throughout the entire society. So in 2020, Hendrix's rendition of the Star Spangled Banner isn't really as controversial as it was in 1969, because, literally 51 years of people have grown up,
hearing it
and just being like, oh yeah, that's how this is supposed to sound. And people don't realize that, oh my God, how entirely disruptive and, controversial.
How offensive it was to a lot of people at that time. And one of the comments on the blog, when I posted it, a friend of mine from the store, and he's not wrong, pointed out that he wasn't sure that Hendrix actually did that as a political protest. Yeah. And I think that's fair, because Hendrix was all about the music. I could see him approaching that purely from this is a piece of music. What can I do with it in my style?
Yeah. I didn't link to that in the blog, but I'm aware. So the interview that he is sort of referencing is Hendrix was about 3 weeks after Woodstock was on the Dick Cavett show. And Cavett asked him about that. He's like, you're taking a lot of flack for your protest moment there. And Hendrix said, oh, that wasn't a protest, man. I just like the song. I was, I'm an American. So I was celebrating America. And yeah. And like, he's clearly stoned out of his fucking mind.
Yeah.
Even like, whatever he necessarily meant by that, but even the idea of like Hendrix claiming to be like, I'm an American patriot kind of thing is, he was that time was also subversive.
Yeah. He was he was in the 101st Airborne, so he had So he had some military experience. There was that sort of thing.
Which Cabot also pointed out.
Everything else about him was like at the time most people.
And to be fair, he was in the 101st Airborne because he got arrested for grand theft auto, and they gave him a choice of jail or the military, and he chose the military. So it's and then by all accounts was the worst soldier of all time.
Would have considered like an American patriot kind of dude. He was everything that the right did not stand for. Right. Yeah.
But but today, and I posted a picture. It's like somebody's artwork of him playing in front of the American flag, and they see him as this patriot. They've like just sort of appropriated the image to be, mom and apple pie. And the very idea that nobody is kneeling is just sort of I'm like, what are you talking about?
Well, it's anachronistic of like people who associate kneeling with Kaepernick when it's like, well, that was not necessarily the association.
Yeah.
That would have existed at the time. Like, I mean, I guess my question is it a situation of people not knowing their history, which I can 100% see, especially because it's not like we teach the history of Jimi Hendrix in high school. Or is it people willfully or is it people willfully trying to co-opt a specific American moment? And like my assumption is that the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I don't know. So. I mean, like, I think that we could take this to a more well-known example in terms of history and what's taught in high school. And we could talk about how MLK is taught.
Sure.
And like, if you get any sort of civil, which I think that most schools do teach the civil rights, but it usually ends up being like Martin Luther King said some kind words.
Mm-hmm. He spoke three sentences in his entire life. He had a dream, something about brown and white children holding hands, and like it's literally just like it's really short.
And Malcolm X didn't exist. No, Black Panthers weren't real.
I got Malcolm X. I actually got Malcolm X. But what they did was they put Malcolm X and Martin Luther King against each other and said, well, look at how peace won out against violence. And like we've talked about...
Shot them both.
we talked a lot about, like how history is taught in other episodes like Watchmen and how things like the Tulsa Massacre just like totally have gotten erased. But, Martin Luther King is an example of conservatives like to meme quote him on Facebook.
Yes.
Which, Mav, I'll let you take this away because I know.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this on the Your Black Friend is Tired episode with when my friend Kingdom and I were talking about arguing with one very specific person who was continuously telling us we were wrong because of this Martin Luther King quote that he saw. One of his examples was Martin Luther King said, stand up against injustice. So therefore, Martin Luther King was against kneeling. Yeah, he's that dumb. Like he doesn't understand that the word stand was metaphorical there. And then we started literally quoting the two of us and, other academic friends of mine, because this was a couple of years ago on my wall. So I had people who study race and culture for a living quoting letter from the Birmingham jail at this individual. And he's like, well, that's not a real quote. That can't be in context. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like he'd literally only seen like 3 memes of Martin Luther King ever. So in his mind, Martin Luther King's, and he said this, Martin Luther King's primary thing was standing for America. He believed in the dream of America, and that's what Martin Luther King was all about. It wasn't about race. This is what a person said to me because, and like,
okay,
yeah. But see, it's what you said before, though. I don't like.
That's like
my
a whole
inclination
level
is
of
he's trolling,
that is.
but he's not. He just doesn't know. He literally doesn't know because think about the people that you see today who are like, well, Martin Luther King said this, Martin Luther King said that. He would not have been for this. He would not have been, he would not have been for burning your cities down. Like Martin Luther King was a democratic socialist. And I'm not saying in the modern sense that like of Bernie Sanders version of democratic socialism, blah, 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 blah. He would have said, Martin Luther King has several speeches where he says, I believe in the values of democratic socialism only when the capitalist system is disavowed. Like he literally goes in depth about using those words in 1965 when socialism meant communist and communist meant pinko. Like he was using those words. So you would not have liked him. Martin Luther King was #1 on the FBI's most wanted list. And people don't understand that. Like they hated him. His popularity rating was 30 when he died.
Right. Well, especially towards the end of his life, he was starting to become more convinced that violent protest actually was necessary in order to bring about
more inevitable.
The civil rights movement.
He was fighting against it. And in the speech where he says riots are the language of the unheard, that's literally after Watts. That's him begging for people to listen to him because he's saying he's literally since about a year before he dies, he's literally saying, look, you're not paying attention to me. I'm trying to do this the peaceful way. If you don't listen to me, there will be riots. There will be civil war. Like that's basically him saying that. And he's like, you're not listening. You're not listening. He said, and he kept saying, I think there's a better way. I think there's a better way, but it's not just up to me. So he understood that it wasn't just him, which is, why he got along with Malcolm X. They were not enemies. Right.
Well, they talked tactics basically.
Yes.
It's like it's like very like a Jekyll and Hyde has the wrong connotation, but
and they're not even Malcolm X. Malcolm X is at least someone that people have heard of without Malcolm X is a person that white people in America in 2020 have probably heard of, even if they have the wrong idea of him. I was talking with a friend of mine after John Lewis's funeral was last week. And I think but for John Lewis dying, a lot of people had never heard of him before. I mean, Wayne, you talked about him when he died, but so you knew who he was. But I mean, he's not, he's been in the news lately, but he's not taught in history books.
Yeah, I didn't know about him for the first
the comic
40 years of my life. Yeah.
Right.
And I'd heard of him before the comic, but not. I didn't. I couldn't have told you a whole lot about him prior to that.
Well, at John Lewis's funeral, there's a point where they had all the former presidents speak, all of them, but the current one who nobody wants to be around. But they all got to give a little eulogy, and Bill Clinton gave his, and he talked about the great work that John Lewis had done back during the civil rights movement, and for reasons that escape me entirely. Bill Clinton compared John Lewis, saying he was favorable in comparison to people doing the wrong thing, like Stokely Carmichael. And I'm sitting here and I talked with Derek, he was also on the BLM episode we did. He and I were talking and I'm like, why is he referencing Stokely Carmichael? There are two kinds of people at this funeral. People who are going to be really pissed about what Bill Clinton just said, and people who have no idea who the fuck Stokely Carmichael is. Stokely's been dead over 20 years. Why are you bringing him up? He was somebody who was a little more militant than, I mean, he's a black leader. He replaced Lewis's head of SNCC. It's a whole thing. But Stokely Carmichael is an important civil rights figure who I guess Bill Clinton didn't like. I don't like John. He was a friend of John Lewis's. They didn't see eye to eye on everything, but like no one sees eye to eye on everything. And I'm like, why are you? But he's a name that nobody even knows, because the way civil rights is taught in American schools is Martin Luther King was one guy who gave two speeches and everybody, everybody lived happily ever after. And that's not true. That's, there's more to it than that. And I think when he gets appropriated as a meme, as just an idea with completely divorced from context, like the Hendrix song, I think that's harmful to the message, and it makes us repeat things over and over again. Like it makes the work harder in 2020 because he's, the actual history of, I bet a lot of people have no idea what the Selma March was even about, or that King went to prison several times. I don't think people know that.
Yeah. I mean, this is probably a whole other episode, but, always, because I follow academics on Twitter who talk about their research, but particularly since the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people have talked about how in their field, women and scholars of color and like knowledge of Indigenous and Black people has always been neglected from the history books and, different kinds of discoveries in science, which Indigenous people already understood because it was not categorized under a certain scientific method, are credited to white men. If I had those Twitter threads available, I wish I could cite them. But, like this kind of stuff always happens. There's a lot that is just taught very inaccurately and a lot skipped over.
You mentioned Tulsa a little bit ago, Hannah, and I think it's going to sound like a compliment for Trump. It's not. Trust me. Trump said something when he canceled that rally, or he didn't cancel it. He moved it a day later because he originally had his Tulsa, Oklahoma rally was scheduled for Juneteenth, and he moved it out of respect for the people complaining because, African Americans celebrate Juneteenth that day. And in respect for that and the great Tulsa riot, I will move it to the next day. And then he said, because of me, people know about Juneteenth and they know about Tulsa and they wouldn't have known otherwise. And the thing is, he's not entirely wrong.
Right.
There are a lot of people who've never heard of Juneteenth or the Tulsa riot.
Yeah, like growing outside of Portland, Oregon, I don't think I knew what Juneteenth was until I went to college.
Right.
Like, I don't think, because it's not, I think, especially depending on where you come from in the United States, it's like, it's not something that's usually addressed in school, but it's also not something that, like, unless it's a part of your community and something, and, like, someone in your community celebrating it in a visible way, like, you don't see it. So, like, coming from, like, a massively white suburb, like, outside of Portland, like, it was just never, like, I'd probably heard the word before, but had no context.
So I guess, I mean, and I guess that's kind of what it is. Like when ideas lose their, I had a friend when Watchmen came out, I had a white friend watch it, and we were talking about it online on a Slack channel, just has a bunch of friends of mine. And my friend was like, I didn't, after the first episode, he's like, I liked it. I thought the beginning, like, it was a little ridiculous to like see an air raid on a random city. Like, it's supposed to be grounded in reality. I can't, how are they going to start it with like the U.S. government bombing a random American city and like no one caring? And then so we sent him the Wikipedia page, and he's like, wait, and he's like, holy shit, that was real? I'm like, yeah, it's real, but like erased. And that's kind of erased for good reason, because no one wants to think about that, as opposed to, I think, with Woodstock and Hendrix, I think it's just sort of it became so much a part of the culture to hear that song that now it's patriotic.
Yeah, well, the Japanese internment camps have been mostly erased as well.
Oh, no. Yeah, we don't like to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean that.
Unless you go to school in Oregon and it's taught mandatory in 4th grade, or at least it was in my school district.
Wow.
Yeah, see, it was never.
Well, because it was our state. Like the vast majority of like on the West Coast, you still learn about it, which I think this is also like, this is again, different episode, but like the history of the West Coast does not figure in the history of the United States very often when it's taught in K through 12. And I think that's part of why is because if you're going to talk about like the history of the West Coast is much more in many respects recent when you're looking at stuff like Japanese internment, like, and not to mention like, you know, the colonization of what used to be Mexico when you're looking at like the Southwest and California. And so like there's atrocities throughout American history, no matter where you look.
Yeah.
A lot of the more recent atrocities have happened on, especially when you're looking at explicitly state and federally sanctioned ones, have happened on the West Coast. I mean, we could even talk about like there's like in my mind there's a reason why like the most recent like visible deployment of federal troops happened in Portland. As opposed to on the East Coast, because most people look at Portland and they think, oh, Antifa, which has been my experience of like moving out to the West Coast. People think like I say Portland, they think of two things, which is weed and Antifa.
Nirvana.
Those are the two associations a lot of people have, and so like I think that even just talking to
I would have said grunge. You guys have bands.
Sure, right. But I think, like, especially people, like, I think that's also, though, for people who are, like, understand why having, like, the incidence of, like, feds being deployed in Portland is a problem might have that association. I'm thinking more of, like, people who, like, oh, well, feds, they have to go, you know, police the rabble-rousers, blah, blah, blah. Because I definitely had members of my own family that like, I had explained to them, like, no, that's not an opinion we're going to hold, or I will literally lose my mind because this is my hometown.
No, but I'm actually glad to hear that because, yeah, I mean, that was something that was never mentioned in, you know, when I was growing up. And I also, you know, that age thing again, you know, that was more recent history when I was young. So there might be more of that stuff being taught now than I'm aware of.
I mean, it was still, and as far as I know, like I can't. I mean, I've got young
still
nephews
pretty limited,
and nieces,
and part of it is also like I went to a fairly progressive school district, so we got Native. Like my teachers taught us like extensively Native American history and about colonization. We learned about Japanese internment. I read about like I remember being in 4th grade reading like very intense stuff about child internment in Auschwitz. And that's how they introduced it. They introduced it. Literally, my teacher was like, which actually my teacher, Karen McAllister, not that she's ever listening, retired this week. Congratulations. The most badass teacher on the planet. But she was literally like, I'm going to teach the Holocaust to 4th graders. And then like a month, like for 1 month. And then the next month, we're going to talk about Japanese internment.
Good for her.
Yeah, she's a badass. And in general, like I think she was the most like vivid example, but I think I had a lot of teachers like her. And I think it is like the passage of time and changes to teaching curriculum, either in programs or elected by the teachers themselves have made a difference. Because I've never met anyone else outside of Oregon that ever had Native American history extensively or learned about Japanese internment. Most people, I've definitely had experiences of even going to grad school, people who were like very educated, super nerds, who didn't know about Japanese internment until I mentioned it. Because I actually have a member of my family, my extended family, who was interned. So for me, it's also like personal and familial history. But like, because in Portland, I will say this though, is like the weird part about it, and I realize this is somewhat a tangent, but also I think this gets to a larger question of how things get normalized, is part of the reason I think we learned, and I say we, I mean Oregonian school children, like of the 90s, because I don't know if it's still taught. I would assume it is, but I think part of the reason we learned it is because Portland specifically has a fairly large, like cultural, like a surprisingly large, like cultural connection to Japan. We have sister cities with a few Japanese cities throughout Oregon. There's a lot of school exchange programs specifically between American and Japanese students, specifically in response to the history of Japanese internment. And unless you have that context from school, you just think that this is some weird thing that because there's a lot of Japanese immigrants here for unknown reasons that Portland does because, you know, nerds like anime or something. And so I think I'm serious because and because it is the West Coast, we have a lot of there's a fairly sizable like Korean population, Japanese population, like that. But like, I think it's just like at this point, I would be curious to know if people still learn that stuff, because I think that casts Portland and Oregon's culture and like the strange relationship it has with East Asian culture in a very different light if you understand it as a response to internment, as well as also the atom bomb, which is a different thing. But then as just like, this is a thing that Portland just does randomly. It's because at this point it's normalized, and unless you know that history, like you probably just go like, well, that's weird.
You mentioned the Native American thing. We got a little bit of that, but it was very much a localized. I mean, where I grew up, southwestern Pennsylvania, French and Indian War and the Revolution and westward expansion during colonial times. So there was a certain amount of acknowledgement of Indian cultures in the area, but it was usually in the context of, and then they massacred this white family.
Yeah,
so we got some of that history, but it was certainly,
we got a fair amount of that. The parts I remember the most time being spent on was like, yes, the history of colonization and basically white people being colonizers and massacring everyone. But a lot of it was also like, here are the like cultural and scientific advancements made by Native Americans. This is how boats were constructed. This is how Native Americans approached like mapping the region, how property worked. So it was also just like learning Native American culture, like specifically situated in the various tribes of the Northwest.
I don't know if I got that in school or because I read a lot of that stuff, but I read a lot on my own. So I don't know how much of that was actually part of my classwork and how much it was just me getting books out of the library. So
I'm wondering, and this goes into the intentionality of the way that we remap history, as opposed to the, just the well, actually, at least I assume it's intentionality. We had a lot of it. I grew up in Ohio. I grew up outside of Cleveland, as I've mentioned on the show before. And as much as there's a lot of reasons to joke about people from Cleveland, many of which are true. I'm not even disagreeing with any of them, but it's 8th grade history in Ohio is, or at least used to be, Ohio history. As opposed to, I think 7th grade was U.S. history and 8th grade was like the history of the state of Ohio. And it's really impossible to do Ohio history without heavily getting into a lot of Native American stuff.
Because everybody lives in a town named for Native American name.
And because there was so much, there's so much happening, but it is an extremely sanctified, everybody got along except for these couple little wars kind of thing. Like it's definitely whitewashed quite a bit. It's there. So, I mean, it's kind of weird because I certainly, we spent weeks talking about Pontiac, like the individual named Pontiac and Sitting Bull. And, we spent weeks on these people. And certainly there's a lot of, Pocahontas, who has, who most people think of as a Disney princess. We talked about that. And there's a lot of, certainly I got more context than anybody who only knows that name from Disney movies, which, is what Wayne's School would have done. But it's certainly not historically.
Yeah, I got more than that. There was a series of books I read as a child from our library, and they had all of them. And it was, and I spent years tracking this down. There's one in specific I wanted for my library, and it's like childhoods of famous Americans, and they were biographies of famous Americans, obviously, and written at that 3rd, 4th, 5th grade level. And they were written as novels, so they were narratives, but they were based on genuine history. And, I remember reading George Washington, Abe Lincoln, and the ones that you remember. But I also read, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And the one I tracked down was Sequoia. Warriors and frontiersmen and whatnot. What's the book Wayne relates to? The guy who created an alphabet for the Cherokee Nation. Right. But that was a book I specifically was trying to track down for years. So I read a lot of that stuff on my own. The books were available in the library.
Right.
I don't know how much we actually talked about any of that in class.
Well, for us, we ignored. There's a lot of rape and murder that we just pretty much ignored.
Yeah,
and which frankly, there's a lot of that. So,
which I think also goes to the question you were raising about intentionality, is that so much of our education, unless you seek it out, like Wayne's talking about, so much of our education can be easily limited to what we learn in elementary school, middle school, high school, and even college. Because especially once you're getting to college, you're looking often looking at specific subjects. Like I never took a straight history course in college. There was aspects of history in my courses, but it wasn't part of my curriculum. I think, and I'm in the humanities, so that's probably even more true of folks that are like in STEM fields, for example. And like
we had a required one. We had one required history. I mean, I took more than that because of an LCS. But we had one required history course for a humanities major at CMU.
I had a really amazing high school history teacher for both American and world history. And I was a history major in undergrad, history and psych. So I took a lot of history classes.
But that was you specializing. That wasn't,
right. And so to Mav's point about intentionality, and also I think Wayne's point about like how much of our education can sometimes be like self-directed based on the classes we choose, the books we seek out. Like, I think there's the issue that like so much of our education is based off of that foundation we learned in like elementary school, middle school, high school, which is limited by what teachers and parents especially think is quote unquote appropriate for children. Like, I know for a fact my fourth grade teacher that taught Auschwitz got a lot of pushback from parents basically going like, you cannot possibly teach the Holocaust to children. They are not prepared for that.
Wow.
Yes.
See, that's standard curriculum for us. That is not.
It was specifically because she assigned a book called like my understanding. And again, I was fourth grade at the time, so I know this through my mom. My understanding is that it was because she assigned a specific book to us called Kinderlager, which is a book that has images reprinted from children's camps from the Holocaust, and fairly it's not written. I would say it's a book that's written to be accessible, but not edited for children.
Gotcha.
It is graphic. But also very frank about, there's like, it's very frank about like what's going on. I mean, like, I can't imagine another way of telling the story of an internment camp without like showing those pictures and explaining like, these are the kinds of things that were done. But I think especially because it was a book about these were the kinds of things that were done to children your age that look like you kind of thing. A lot of, like there was pushback from parents, and like, when I think about like what a watered down version of teaching the Holocaust would look like, and we apply that logic of like wanting to protect children for like reasons I don't think are entirely misguided, but like when you apply that logic to things like the civil rights movement, to police brutality, to like class warfare, to all kinds of different things, it becomes clear to me how people get a very stilted view, not only of American history, but history in general. And if that's the foundation you're building on, and you don't have the intellectual curiosity or the resources to go beyond that, I kind of get how you get to the point of like, you look at a Hendrix meme and you think that's real.
Wow. See, I'm like shocked that you guys. So for us, again, I'm a little older than you. And Diary of Anne Frank and Eli Wiesel's Night are standard curriculum for everyone. Everyone in my school district just reads both of those in like 5th or 6th grade, maybe 4th.
Yeah, we certainly didn't.
I mean,
wow.
I think that the Night's pretty frank and graphic. But I think that Anne Frank's diary is seen as less troubling for like younger readers, because it's more about the hiding and like her experiences before she and her family so like I got introduced to the Holocaust through Anne Frank's diary and a couple of other things, but nothing quite as graphic as what Katya described. I read Night because my father was like, you need to know, here, read this and we will discuss it. So it wasn't
which I think is like, I don't know, and I say this as a not parent, but like I understand why parents and teachers have this hesitation to want to have those conversations, but at the same time, it's like, this is what's going to need to know this stuff. I mean, it's like, I think a lot of people are talking about this of like, particularly white parents, about how to talk to your children about racism, because like, if you wait to have conversations about white supremacy until they're quote unquote older, it's too late in a lot of cases, which is not to say people can't change, but like, you are now trying to potentially reverse something that's already happened, rather than prevent the kid from developing, or at least being unaware of certain things in the world until they're an adult.
Well, I have to throw in the comic stuff that Marcel and I have worked on, the CHUTZ-POW comics that are telling stories of the Holocaust. And they are aimed, I mean, I've never been instructed in as a creator of how you tell the story. I've been left to my own devices. But we want to aim it at at least a middle school reading level, challenging for middle school. And there are educators working at the Holocaust Center who have developed lesson plans and class plans around the stories that we've written. I have a binder here that is it was kind of flattering and stunning. I did research before writing these stories. But they hand me this book that here's the teacher's resource guide for issue 1. Like, holy shit, we have all that awesome in there, and it's amazing. And it's available. The comics are available through Amazon. The teacher's guide is also available through Amazon. Shameless plug. But they're designing it to be taught. And I know that, the stuff that I've been writing and working on has been taught in middle schools and high schools and in colleges. There was a woman who was using it at Pitt, a year or so ago. They have put together some just phenomenal, just little things like in my script, I will mention a town and here's 2 pages on the history of that town.
That's cool.
So they've done phenomenal work expanding on those stories, but it's very much meant as, yes, here's a comic and here's a story and it's a narrative and it should be entertaining and engaging, but it's very much aimed as an educational tool.
So now you're doing, I mean, not you because you just wrote the original, but they who wrote this guide are doing actual literary criticism, which is important. They're giving context to what you're reading, which
and further resources. Yes. All that stuff.
Which, if you go back to like the episode where we talked about Gone with the Wind and the changes that they made for when, when they brought it back and they added that little 5-minute blurb at the beginning, that 5-minute blurb is important. Having cultural context to what you read and what you absorb is important, not because. So I think this is very, very weird. We did our whole episode on the author is dead, right? We've talked about that. And yes, I do think that, whatever a text means to you, and I'm saying text now because I'm including things like speeches or movies or music by Hendrix. Yeah. Whatever a cultural object means to you, an artifact means to you, that is important and that is valid. And if you feel all gung-ho about America because you're listening to Hendrix's national anthem, if you want to play that, if you want to, in fact, it'd be awesome. If you want to open football games or baseball games with Hendrix's rendition, yes, wonderful. I have no problem with that. But I also think that it's important to keep the context of when the object was produced. I think both things are important to study in order to have a full understanding of it.
Yeah.
Right, especially because as we've talked before, a lot of times, like things becoming mainstream is part of like the normal progression of culture.
Right.
Like things always, like not everything, but in general, things tend to move from the fringes of culture towards this, what commonly we would refer to as like the center, or we could talk about the hegemonic culture if we want to be more technical.
Remember when the Beatles used to be transgressive?
Yeah, right.
That was a long time ago.
In like every
elevators,
everywhere, basically, because it's like considered nothing. Like, because now at this point, everyone's like, oh, well, no one could possibly be offended by the Beatles. Well, it's like, well, at one point in history, everyone was offended by the Beatles.
Well, John Lennon's song "Imagine" is, he's recommending atheism and communism.
I've heard it played at churches,
and everybody loves that song. Like you completely missed the point of it.
Also, just in case anyone's wondering, so you want a revolution is not actually revolutionary. And by saying revolution, I mean revolution because I just apparently want to misquote the song. I don't care. I don't care about the Beatles. I listened to them to be transgressive because my mother didn't like them, and now.
What era did you grow up in?
I imagine in my head, Hannah grew up in like 1947, except for I know she didn't.
Hannah is in fact a time traveler, and she's been lying. I think she has a TARDIS. She just hasn't told us about.
I bought that single.
Explanation.
I bought that single and experienced 45 revolutions per minute.
God.
Also, I sarcastically named a subheading of my 3rd chapter on Tell Two Cities, Say You Want a Revolution, and I'm mocking both Dickens and the Beatles.
That is a very niche title of nerdery, and I think that should tell everyone listening who hasn't gone through a graduate program, this is how we entertain ourselves in grad school, guys. This is how it happens.
Yeah. Anyway,
I guess we've like covered this aspect of like there is a lack of like there is like a lack of context, or in some cases a lack of education that leads to stuff like the Hendrix meme that you start the show with have. But like I guess that but I still feel like the other side of the coin is people purposefully ignoring that stuff because one of the questions I remember we talked about when we were initially talking, like wanting to do the show, was like people, like to what extent are people consciously appropriating these things for an ideological purpose?
I think it's both.
Yeah, I think there is just some Borg-like assimilation of it. It's been around so long that people, they're not aware of the original context of it, and it just gradually is absorbed into the culture and takes on a different meaning.
I mean, there's certain, Hannah, you said it's, a little of both, right? And I think it is because...
Yeah. Well, I think that we can talk about mine and Katya's grad program right now as an example of something that's a little bit of both, especially more of the, I think, appropriating. So Duke is where Katya and I went for our programs, in case...
You somehow missed that from our mirrored episode.
Yes, and so, like, in 1969, some Duke students, importantly, like, members of the Afro-American Society, occupied the Allen Building, which, for those of you who are not, like, Dukies, I can't believe I said that word.
Oh my God! Do you guys really call yourselves Dukies?
I do not, but people who are fans of
it's usually, in my experience, it's usually used pejoratively.
Yeah.
How could it not be?
I kind of am at this point. Anyway, the Allen Building is the administration building. Also, the English building for some weird reasons on the third floor, but that's not important. Anyway, they took over the Allen Building. As a protest.
Not just weird reasons, Stanley Fish reasons, but only English people know what that means.
They took over the Allen Building as a protest for civil rights. And so, like, there have been over the years, there have been other student movements that have, like, built upon this protest and have, sat in like, the administrative offices. We had one, specifically, and mine and Katya's time there, I can't remember the year, protesting.
Yeah, it was, so we had, basically, so this is it's a very historic protest at Duke, and it is remembered as such in the archive. Duke, during our time there, Duke did at least one, if not actually several, like, library exhibits about the Allen Building takeover, as well as, like, other momentous, like, on-campus protests. And I think the reason this is kind of a salient example is because, as Anna and I have referenced before on the show, both of us were involved in the early stages of the Duke Graduate Student Union. During the election fight of that union, there were, in the, like, very initial stages of it, the original activists on campus that were trying to get the movement for grad unionization rolling. One of their first major protests that, like, got a lot of visibility was occupying the Allen Building. Duke was not pleased, to put it lightly.
And so, like, there's been other, like, important protests that I guess, the one that I actually think I want to talk more about is in 1968, there was a silent vigil at Duke, which followed the death of Martin Luther King. And in April 2018, President Vincent Price was honoring, like, alumni who were involved in, like, these, like, protests and vigils in the 60s. And a undergraduate student group called People Stay at the University, like, stormed the stage at his alumni address. And they, like, had, a series of, like, not requests, demands.
They were presenting a bunch of demands on the part of the student body, but also on the part of multiple campus unions.
Right. And
many of the campus unions, worker unions, actually have their origins in the events of 1968. So that, like, part of it is also that history is directly connected to the history that was being supposedly celebrated by this campus event.
Right, which is why...
so they're not just, like, interrupting it randomly. It was there was an actual historical connection as well.
Which is, like, if you read their demands, the first thing they, like, cite is implement $15 per hour for Duke employees, like, which includes everybody, because Duke famously was praised a couple of years ago for a $15 an hour minimum wage, but that didn't apply across the board. So the administration typically decided to try and punish the students who stormed the stage, even though they were protesting at an event that was celebrating protest. And thankfully, eventually, they got pushback, so it was dropped. But this is just kind of sort of the we celebrate protest, but it should be
I gotta say, if you have an event that's celebrating protest, it makes sense to expect one.
Right, exactly. Well, and it was, and one of the reasons it got a lot of ire on campus, but also in some of the local media outlets, was basically because, like, the thing that the students were protesting was basically the way that Duke itself had not lived up to the demands of the original 68 protest. Because Duke famously, both not only the grad union, but also the other unions, like Duke is well known in Durham and the surrounding area for being like anti-labor, often has a lot of very racist administrators, not to mention the racist roots of the institution itself on top of it.
Also the racist actions of like Duke undergrads in the community, or the lack of care for like people who like work at Duke or go to Duke who live off campus and move into like gentrifying neighborhoods in particular right now. Right. And then
and it's basically like, so like that entire moment was very much like, not only are we going to do this weird thing where we're going to co-opt protest, like sort of in the Hendrix meme sense, but we're also then going to use that moment to cover over the ways that we have failed to respond to that protest, while simultaneously congratulating ourselves for having an activist student body.
Yes.
While also punishing the current activist student body. It's like it's layers of goddamn.
And I have to say that if you're interested in reading more about this history, we have some links in the show notes to the Chronicle and some Duke archives, which covers some of these protests and vigils.
And a lot of it actually continues also in the COVID era, where, you know,
of course,
Duke, along with many other institutions, is failing to protect students, workers, and all kinds of stuff. So, you know, while they're not talking about 1968 anymore, because that would be inconvenient.
I mean, this summer, you know, the unions at Duke, graduate student union, the different workers unions have banded together to ask the administration to take them into account when planning how they're going to handle the fall semester.
As has been happening at universities across the country as well.
Right. UNC, right next door. Yeah. So, I mean, like, I think that, you know, like, I mean, this is true at, like, family dinner table experiences I've had where people have, and we talked about this before on, like, even the sports show we did a long time ago, I think, honestly, about 2 years ago, when we talked about Colin Kaepernick and how people were, you know, upset that he was protesting during their NFL game, and how could he, when, you know, like, why couldn't it be more convenient? And, like, it's not like we're in the civil rights movement anymore, and then, you know, if you know about civil rights, you might point out that, hey, protest is supposed to be inconvenient, that's the point, and what he's doing is pretty, like, peaceful and
tame in comparison of what could be done.
Extremely tame. I mean, like, there was a massive explosion of tweets after George Floyd was murdered about how Colin Kaepernick was trying to, you know, point this out peacefully like several years ago, which is like the case of like literally every.
Yeah, he was doing the thing that people are asking for now. Why can't they protest peacefully? Well, you didn't like that either.
And that's where I mean, that goes back into the memefication thing that I was talking about. And it's sort of, I gave a definition in the call for comments of what I'm using meme both ways. I'm using it to refer to, you know, the graphics on the internet, which is what we usually mean when we say it. But I also mean in the sociological sense, because that's what we do. Yeah. But like
which is the original sense of the term.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So he was doing something that, you know, the brilliance of his protest wasn't just that it was peaceful. The brilliance of Colin Kaepernick's protest before he got fired, I mean, is that he literally did almost nothing. It was the least, I mean, for his actual physical effort, which is to say, like the calories that he was expending personally to do it, was the least amount of work that he could have possibly done to start a protest. All he did was just, like, you know, kneel there. Like, he literally, like, it was probably more work to stand up. And like the brilliance of it was the entire actual protest, all of the notoriety that grew around it was generated by people who largely disagreed with him, right? Like, like nobody who was in support of BLM had a problem with it.
Had it not been for sports pundits talking about it, who I don't think I've watched an entire football game in the last 10 years, would have no bloody idea
who he even was.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
I know his name as the guy who kneels, not as he plays football.
Well, and see, and here's the thing. Like, so I'm a football fan, so I did know who he was ahead of that. And it's sort of like, I remember I was mentoring another teacher a couple of years ago, and we were talking about protests and stuff in the class, and she brought that up as an example. This is, you know, well, what do you think about, say, this? What, you know, she was trying to talk about how speech takes other forms than just actual things that people say. And she had said, well, for instance, this is a powerful statement because that he did this without saying anything. He doesn't have a job today, and he'd probably be starting in the NFL. And then she said that, and you could tell it was like me, and there were like three guys in the class who clearly were football fans, and one of whom was probably leaning towards MAGA side, and the other two were not, and all three of them were like, eh. And so I do know enough about Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick was the third. Well, at that point, he was the backup because the guy was hurt, but he was the third string quarterback on the worst team in the NFL at the time. So he wasn't lighting the world on fire. He'd been in a Super Bowl a couple of years before, but he wasn't doing a lot at that point. If Colin Kaepernick had been more famous, then probably they might have, like, if Colin Kaepernick was winning Super Bowls at that moment, people would have found a way to ignore him or to let it go or get it. What made his protest worthy for me, what made it notable, was that he was willing to lose everything because he didn't have like Tom Brady, dumbass that he is can do whatever. Right. He can do whatever he wants. He's never going to get fired. Because while Colin Kaepernick was starting his kneeling protest, at the same time, they did an interview where they started talking to other people who were also not standing for the national anthem. And they asked Marshawn Lynch if he was going to participate. And Marshawn Lynch said, I'm not going to kneel. I'm sitting on the bench, just like I've done every game my entire career. I don't stand for that dumbass racist song. And nobody touched Marshawn Lynch because Marshawn Lynch is a football team by himself. and no one was going to screw with that. Like, they just let it go.
And nobody noticed he'd been sitting.
Yeah, no one noticed he'd been sitting, and they weren't, and he was disrespectful about it. But no one's going to protest Marshawn Lynch because they just can't afford to fire him. So that's what made Kaepernick notable.
Well, the fans are like, we don't want to. We want the guy who scores the point.
Yeah, he's Marshawn Lynch is amazing. So I understand that, but then the problem with it is with people who for a while, people like Trump saying, fire that son of a bitch, like him doing that. Like he helped make Kaepernick's movement grow just by complaining about it. But then the movement becomes assimilated because as it seeps more and more into the pop culture zeitgeist, it became about the flag. Well, he's protesting the flag. There's no fucking flag there. If anything, he's protesting the song, which he's also not doing, but it's not like he's kneeling for the flag. The flag's just there. I mean, there are flags, but it's not like it's not like he starts kneeling when they bring the flag out. He starts kneeling when they start playing the song, but it became about the flag, even though that wasn't his intention, because part of what makes the memes work is how the culture adapts it at the time, right? So now the reason you have people making things like that Hendrix meme is because in the mind of whatever idiot made that meme, well, the thing that is protesting America is to kneel, which was not a thing before Kaepernick, I mean, and Kaepernick chose it to be respectful. They don't even know. Like, Kaepernick sat down the first 2 weeks of his protest, and then a friend of his was like, basically, he talked to this guy who was a Navy SEAL, and the guy was like, if you're going to do this, do it right. I don't want you to sit. I want you to kneel because that's a movement of respect. And I don't want anybody to ever say that you're disrespecting the anthem. So you are showing that you are respecting it in a different way. It's a military thing. So that's why he picked kneeling. He changed because he's like, oh, OK, I get it. So if I kneel, then I'm respectfully protesting. And he said, you'll always be able to fall back on it. And it didn't work because people just ignored it. They have no idea. Like, they're like, well, you should be standing with your hand over your heart, like we always done. Newsflash, we did not always stand with our hand over our heart. We didn't start doing that till World War II. We used to do the same salute that they used for, like, we used to do essentially the Nazi salute of putting your hand forward. We changed that because the Nazis were using it. So the idea of standing with your hand over your heart is only about 80 years old at this point. Just so you're 75 years old at like today. So it hasn't always been there. The idea of playing the national anthem at football games happened after the World War II. Do you know when they started having players come out to salute the national anthem? 2003. So you're nostalgic about something. It was after 9/11. You're nostalgic about something that started happening like after you started watching football. If you watch football, you don't remember it from when you were a kid because it wasn't, unless you're 20 years old today. It's, you know, it's a thing that started happening after 9/11, and we started doing it because the Army paid us to. It's a fucking commercial. So like, but like it became a thing. It's got power now because that's what they're attached to. They're attached to this tradition from a little while ago.
And that's the way memes work. It's a virus. This idea disseminates, and suddenly it has always been true.
Yep. So it's weird because like I don't know how to handle that. I mean, I gave the example of I talked about a couple of them, but there's songs like "Born in the USA" by Springsteen, which he wrote, and then immediately when he wrote it, Ronald Reagan started using it as a campaign song. It was still on the charts, and Ronald Reagan's like, "This one's mine," and Springsteen and his people were like, you maybe want to listen to this a little closer. I don't think you want to use the song. And so eventually Reagan dropped it. And then it was not immediately, but then Bob Dole used it in 1996. And then Pat Buchanan used it in the year 2000. And it's like, do you people have you listened to the lyrics at all? It doesn't make any sense.
Just that whole thing of politicians using songs like that. And you know, particularly the right appropriating some pretty liberal messages from performers. Saw a headline. There's a site called The Hard Times, which is sort of the Onion for music fans.
Yes, I'm familiar. It's
it cracked me up because it said Joe Biden gets cease and desist order from Ted Nugent for his constant use of wang dang sweet poon tang. So none of the rest of you know that song.
Old. Well, I mean, yeah. My really topical example was to point out that George H.W. Bush tried to use "Don't Worry, Be Happy" by Bobby McFerrin. Yeah, and then Bobby McFerrin started campaigning, like not only coming out for and endorsing, but he was like politically actively like campaigning for Michael Dukakis. So Bush changed it to start using he started using Woody Guthrie. Yes. This Land Is Your Land as his campaign song.
Has anyone listened to that song all the way through? Which like I'm not saying that like its message is 100% because stolen land and all that, but also like
this machine kills fascists.
Hannah, some people aren't that bright.
But also like I don't think that song really believes in private property.
No, it does not. It does not. It's literally and Woody Guthrie in life was a communist, and I don't mean that in the way that like conservative people insult like
literal actual believe in the technical tenets of communism.
he was literally the most of a pinko, pinko swine as everything that you're afraid of, like Joe Biden being. That was Woody Guthrie. What are you doing? But but today, This Land Is Your Land is an American. It's an American treasure. It's and like because we can do that, we play songs on. I've heard advertisements that use "Born in the USA."
So I believe what we're saying here is that every conservative, if they want to, needs to think a liberal for basically everything that they love about Americana. I think that's where we've gotten here.
Well, you do. Like, I mean, because not just a liberal, but like, when I said when I did my rant after the George Floyd murder and like I waited a couple of days. I don't know if you guys remember. I wrote, the first thing I did was I re-forwarded this rant that I'd written after Ferguson a couple of years ago. And then I said, I need to wait a couple of days. And I waited till the night the riots started to actually write my new rant, because I was waiting for the riots to start, because what I wanted to talk about was the people saying, well, rioting never solved anything. Martin Luther King was against this. You'd be ashamed of you, blah, 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 blah. And I said something in that rant, which Barack Obama said like a week later. I'm like, fuck you. I did that first. But like everything that you've ever gotten in this country that you enjoy happened because of riots. The fucking country is solved. It was started over a riot over tea, and they're like, and I said that, and the guy was like, well, that wasn't the Boston Tea Party. That wasn't a riot. And I'm like, yeah, it was. It was a bunch of idiots vandalizing private property.
What is the technical definition of riot that they're using? Is Black it just people. A congregation? Right. Is it like
Black people? Black
It
people.
was a riot if you own the tea company.
Yeah. They're like, it was nonviolent. And I'm like, they invaded
and actually,
something.
like,
It was,
after the Boston, like, a lot of people, I mean, this is one of the things that people talk about, like, historically, of, like, why Thomas Paine's Common Sense was so important, is, like, that was for those who don't know, Common Sense was a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine that basically was about, like, why you should stand for freedom, liberty, blah, 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 all the American stuff. I haven't read in a while, but anyway, part of the reason that Common Sense was so important is because prior to that, actually, a lot of people living in what would be the United States were saying the exact same things people were saying about riots now. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, this is destruction of property. This is inappropriate. This is all these kinds of things. Like Common Sense was one of the things, not the only thing, that like changed public opinion to being more in favor of the revolution. And I mean, throughout the American Revolution, there were significant portions of the population that were not about it.
right.
Like this was not a unanimous decision.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
And that's what happens. See, riots change, cultural change over time. And now in 2020, America was all about, we believe this thing where America was always about this and America was always about that, because there's a clip that was on John Oliver a couple weeks ago where they were showing some city council meeting, and some guy, or city council meeting or school board meeting that with parents, and some guy stood up and he said, well, I think the most important thing, what I really want my kids to learn from school is American exceptionalism. I want them to understand that we are the greatest country on the face of the earth. And I'm like, that's not a good thing. You're asking the schools to teach you lies. But like,
you're also asking schools to be like nationalist propaganda.
Right.
Like,
and that's what he wants.
Because there is almost no metric by which that is true.
No.
There is literally no metric by which that is true.
Well,
I would dare say.
we're number one in a lot of things. They just happen to be the bad thing.
Well, yeah, but that's not great unless I guess we're going by Trump's
coronavirus cases, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we are.
I think I might be ending this show with the end bumper might be the clip from Newsroom where he's like, America's not the greatest country on the face of the earth, which is a good rant. If I don't end it, I will at least link to that entire rant in the show notes. But
well, I think like the thing that always like really like, there's so many things that piss me off about people being stupid in the news. I'm not just going to limit to one, but one of the many things that pisses me off is like, I'm not a particularly like American, whatever, patriot, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that does rub me the wrong way is it's like the whole people that claim to be that, but then are constantly about maintaining status quo, have no idea, like not even necessarily the whole like MAGA, make America great again for this like nostalgic time that never existed.
Mm-hmm.
But even just people that are trying to maintain the power dynamic that exists right now in this moment.
It's usually a status quo that got there through blood, sweat, and tears, and not that long ago.
People that are arguing, that are arguing for stasis and that somehow maintaining what is current is the American thing, and people who critique it are somehow un-American, have such a gross misunderstanding of all of American history. Even people I don't like from American history, recent and distant. Like the thing that got them in history books was precisely because they were trying to make the world a different place. Not always a better one,
different,
but a different place.
Yes.
And like, I think one of the things that spoke to me when I started grad school was I'm someone who's always been really fascinated by American history and history in general, and oddly, war and what makes people want to go to war. But one of the things that actually a scholar of science fiction said to me was that the Declaration of Independence and every other like revolutionary tract, all of those are works of science fiction. They are things this is a thing that one day we hope exists.
Yes.
They're aspirational documents. They were not a description of this is what the world is in this moment, because they couldn't be, even by people who believed that they were, because slavery was a thing. Among other things, women couldn't vote or own property in many cases, et cetera, et cetera. I can continue.
So we've gotten there as close as we've gotten to the flying car.
Right, exactly. So like, right. And it's like, if you actually, to me, it's like, if you actually want to claim to be an American patriot or whatever, if you want to use that language, it's like, well, then you should actually be fighting to actualize those documents that you claim that you believe in and clearly have never read.
I mean, like,
clearly do not want to read because you want them to be, you want whatever cozy little corner of classist white supremacy that you have, you want that to be the world because that is comfortable to you and familiar. And God, I hate people some days.
I mean,
so
the
much.
whole reason most of us, if we have, I don't mean us on this show, but the reason why most people have full-ish middle class and so on jobs is because of labor rights, both in the United States and elsewhere. And guess what? There were lots of riots in the 19th century.
Women have the right to vote because of riots. Like, we have whatever level of equality we have right now from race and gender because of riots. Like, literally everything good about your life in the United States happened because of a riot.
Yep.
All of it.
I mean, like, yeah, just...
The Civil War was a 5-year riot.
Yes.
And also, yeah, just it's all a lot. We should all do some more reading. And also, like, I think that if anything history has taught us, it's not just we should do the reading, but find ways to put that into action, even if we sometimes screw up.
You, dear listener, should consider going to a protest, whatever that means to you, whether it's screaming in the streets or writing better memes. I accept writing better memes as a form of very low bar protest. Like, you know, as much as I bitch about the limitations of online protest, see one of our previous episodes, I accept better memes. If that's what you gets you here,
and like
I'm for it. Get the Gen Zers
and maybe perhaps signing
Gen Xers,
petition or like tweeting as part of a hashtag isn't the most one could do, but it's not nothing.
Yeah. So have we resolved anything?
No, we've resolved nothing.
No. I guess we've resolved that we're going to have a Marble League show.
I love how effortlessly you slid right back into that. That was great.
That was awesome.
I mean, I will say, I didn't mention at the top of the show, I have made an exciting and important personal commitment in my life.
Okay.
I have picked a Marble League team.
And what is the team?
The Raspberry Racers.
Okay.
I'm not going to lie. Part of it was a no small reason because, one, red is one of my favorite colors.
And they're winning a lot.
And two, I do in fact have a raspberry beret. And I will be wearing it once it is no longer the surface of the sun. Oh. Sorry?
Is it the kind you find in a secondhand store? Nice. Wow. Geez, if she doesn't get that reference, then
it actually is the kind that you get from a secondhand store. And yes, I got that reference. Okay, why do you think I wanted to wear a raspberry beret for the bloody Marble League? I am insulted, sir. I am younger than you. I am not a child.
Katya and I got our trivia question right, actually, when they played Raspberry Beret, and they were like, who sings this song? And we knew.
How is that a trivia question? Jesus, that's a trivia question?
We went to mediocre trivia, one, and two, I believe that was the trivia week that was all themed after clothing, which I want to say is one of the few trivia categories I have ever excelled at, because if there's one thing I know, it is obscure things that relate to fashion history.
I'm also pretty sure that was a week that only Katya and I were our team, and so we just drank a lot of cider and listened to songs about clothes.
It was also covered by the Hindu love gods, but that's another story. Orange Yvonne.
It's just to call like Raspberry Beret an obscure musical reference. It's just
it's an obscure musical reference. I was referring to the general, like, most people don't know fashion history, which, like, fair enough.
Okay, that I'll accept. I'm just
also,
like,
that was the easy.
Raspberry Beret is the least obscure musical history.
No, that was like the easy song. They always like give you one, so like you should know this if you haven't lived under a rock. Like,
and also to be fair, you got roughly like 3 seconds of the song.
Mm-hmm.
What's that incredibly patriotic song that Ronald Reagan used as a campaign hymn?
Raspberry Beret.
Boy.
Raspberry Beret, yes.
That would be great. That would be great. I love that.
Anyway. The Raspberry Racers. Yeah, I have a team now.
And the logo's nice.
We can't have all the same teams. That would be boring.
No one
we would have to actually be nice to each other.
No one here is cheering for the O-Rangers, so we're all okay.
No, that was.
So, what exactly is your beef with the O-Rangers?
They're like the Patriots.
I'm pretty sure that all of the O-Rangers are on steroids. I'm willing to say that. I just they're juicing.
All right. I have not yet informed I don't have a strong opinion on that yet. I don't know. I'm still working through the Marble League backlog. I'm caught up on 2020. I'm now going back through earlier seasons to have a firmer grounding in the history and tradition of Marble League.
So you're doing research for the episode?
I mean, I'm just doing research for general Katya life because, like, I mean, I think we've discussed this on the episode on the podcast before. This is close to the most on-brand Katya media art thing that exists. But the only thing that could make it more on-brand Katya is if somehow you could put like vintage sewing and knitting into it. But the problem would be, I think if that happened, my brain might literally stop functioning.
Yeah,
like I literally had to gear myself up to watch this because I was like, I'm about to be overwhelmed with whimsy. And I'm excited for it. I'm pumped, but also like not prepared.
Anyway, listeners,
we need to end the show before you do all of our recap shows.
Yeah. Anyway, watch for the final event, August 16th, link where we will be discussing the Marvel League.
Yes. Hannah, anything other than Marvel League you would like to promote?
I tweeted
plug?
finally.
Oh.
You can follow me on Twitter at Hanley Rogers if you want to see my mysterious tweets.
And Katya.
For Yuge, you can find me on the Instagram at Just That Nerd Kid, but mainly for sewing content and occasionally cats.
And Wayne.
We're going to link in the show notes. I sent you the links. Since I mentioned a couple of my blog posts about those children's history books in Sequoia, go read those. Get my blog some traffic. So.
WayneWright.com.
Yeah, that's
the show notes.
Yeah, it's linked in the show notes. Those specific blogs are linked in the show notes.
Yeah. And you can follow me on my personal blog at www.chrismaverick.com or at Chris Maverick on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, all of the places. You can follow the show all of the places at Vox Popcast. And you can follow the show's blog at www.voxpopcast.com, where you find out about what we're going to be talking about next week and can give us feedback and your thoughts. Hint, it's Marvel League. I think. Yeah, it should be next week. But yes. And you can also give us suggestions of what you'd like to hear us talk about on future shows. If you enjoy the show, and we certainly hope you do, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever the hell else you get podcasts from. And do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review, especially on Apple Podcasts, on iTunes. That helps other people find the show, especially if you don't just rate the show, but if you write a review, you just tell us what you like about it. Tell us anything. Just
tell us your favorite Marble League team.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of curious. And, as long as it's not the Yale Rangers. But I mean,
if it is the Yale Rangers, at least we'll have things to talk about on the podcast.
Yes, I guess. But yeah, let us know. Give us your thoughts. Give us your thoughts on what you like about the show. And especially do us a favor right now, as you listen to this, please go over to our YouTube channel and subscribe to us on YouTube. We're trying to unlock some of the benefits that happen as you subscribe on YouTube. We need more people. So if you subscribe to us on YouTube, that really helps us out. Like and subscribe to a couple of videos, and they're fun. The videos are really fun because you can see, not so much on this show, because today we didn't really talk about things like TV shows or movies or anything. But a lot of times I'll put up pictures of whatever we're talking about so that you can see them as we talk. So definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel and give us comments there. I like reading them, and it does help out. I would like to thank Maximilian of Thoughtform Music for our epic theme song, building ever so more epically and playing us out. I'd like to thank you at home for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
And with a straight face, you're going to tell students that America is so star-spangled awesome that we're the only ones in the world who have freedom? Canada has freedom. Japan has freedom. The UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Australia, Belgium has freedom. So 207 sovereign states in the world, like 180 of them have freedom. All right. And yeah, you, sorority girl, just in case you accidentally wander into a voting booth one day, there's some things you should know. And one of them is, there is absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 178th in infant infant mortality, third in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. We lead the world in only 3 categories: number of incarcerated citizens per capita, number of adults who believe angels are real, and defense spending, where we spend more than the next 26 countries combined, 25 of whom are allies. Now, none of this is the fault of a 20-year-old college student, but you nonetheless are, without a doubt, a member of the worst generation ever. So when you ask what makes us the greatest country in the world, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Yosemite?